Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 6 of Duffington Talks. 6 episodes in, really enjoying doing this podcast, and this podcast specifically is, an um, absolutely must listen because today's podcast we're going to talk about Diane Abbott's comments on race and racism and the Jewish community, and travellers and Irish. I think she also lumped in, and I'm going to use that as a springboard to get into some seriously meaty um, comments on the issue, and just try and fight everyone. It seems like I'm not fighting everyone, but there are a lot of people that I think there is a lack of understanding on this situation. It really is like, and people are right in saying. Well, we'll get into that later. It's almost breaking out into an introductory monologue, but yeah, we'll get there when we get there. Couple of things that I want to say before sort of housekeeping. First off, I want to criticize people that were criticizing Elon Musk, um, specifically for the Starship explosion. Now, I um, really, really, really think that Elon Musk has, and we'll look at something in a second. Elon Musk has things that you can genuinely criticize him for, should genuinely criticize him for, because um, he, he has issues where I think that he's on the whole an intelligent guy, um, but there is definitely some overcompensation. Um, just general like trying to look like an expert on a lot of things, um, which I really dislike because you got to play, you got to play in, on home turf with a lot of issues, and if you are such a, um, if you're, we'll actually get into this because even if you're a journalist, you can make yourself look like a bit of a buffoon with what you're saying. But yeah, they tested a rocket that worked and then didn't work, so it got to um, I think it was 40 seconds. It blew up after it got so far into their test, and then decoupled and blew up. Um, Now the thing is with these tests is that obviously it's unmanned, they're trial and error, and they're like data gathering as well. They obviously don't want it to blow up, but that rocket wasn't going to Mars. It was going to drop eventually. Like this is a test, really, and the people just like attacking Elon. He's got a vision. And this is one of the things, him with Tesla and with SpaceX. I think that you just let him do his thing because he's only trying to do it for the benefit of you know I don't want to say humanity because obviously it's making him a lot of money, so there is a big profit there. But of all of the people of all of the ways to make money, he's relatively harmless. This enterprise anyway. His Twitter enterprise, on the other hand, is just absolutely chaotic. So if you want to attack him, and this is where we go into people, this literally seconds after it was people just taking the mic, um and obviously people are going to do that, but I feel like then you put more emphasis on some things and less emphasis on others. So we had an article, we had a tweet from Elon Musk, um, and then it was an article from the Daily Star by Ewan Glido. No idea how to pronounce that name. Probably got it wrong. Knowing me, I'm horrible with name pronunciations. So Elon Musk um, tweeted that essentially that there were birth rate problems uh, towards during Julius Caesar's reign. Now, for anyone that knows um, Roman history, you know that that's pretty much a nothing statement. But however, he was insinuating like it was the fall, it was like the end of the Roman Empire sort of situation, because he linked it to a fall of civilization point, like he was linking it to a fall of civilization thread on Twitter, and then casually brought up Julius Caesar's reign. Um, well, firstly, Julius Caesar um, reigned for a month. He literally he was dictator for life in February, and he was assassinated in March. Whilst I think that there is factual data. There's a paper in the 90s about birth problems in the late Roman Republic, which is where Caesar is from, and then the early Roman Empire, which is Augustus's reign. Augustus being the grandnephew of Caesar, if I'm not mistaken. God, my relative, he was adopted by Caesar. That's all you need to know. Octavian became Augustus. Yada yada yada. Not so okay on the history off the top of my head. It's not my area of expertise, but saying that Julius Caesar, what we're going to get into, what Ewan Gleedow wrote was just a crime against journalism, really. So Elon Musk, this is what I mean. He's talking on a thread, and he's linking this fall of civilization rhetoric. Um, he's talking about is absolute nonsense. The reason why is because the paper that he's pseudo citing a paper, because he's like acting like this is information from a paper in the 90s. The paper um, basically summarizes that the birth, one of the issues they maybe men struggled with conception was that they had boiling hot baths, which is scientifically fine, but the paper also puts it in context that infant mortality was ridiculously high. I mean, the average life expectancy has been calculated to be about 20, because infant mortality was so high. So the author of the paper himself recognizes said issues, and is just putting it in context of a wider societal trend of having problems with childbirth and that sort of issue. So Elon Musk is pseudo citing this paper. He's not. He probably has read it, because I read it a couple of years ago and then re-looked it up when Elon was talking about it, and it's sort of the only paper I can see going in the direction of what Elon is talking about. Either that, or Elon has completely made this up and lucked into the fact that there is this paper talking about the early republic, late republic, early empire. Now I'm just mincing my words. Yeah, so that was horrible. Like just horrible, unhistorical, tweeted by Elon Musk, who is. This is, Elon Musk attacks fact checkers. Will get fact checked, but no one will care, because people will see the Elon Musk tweet and go, "Oh yeah, Elon Musk, oh look, nugget of wisdom. He's just said something that's completely and utterly it's just meaningless." Caesar reigned for a month, and you've linked it to a thread at the fall of civilization. The Roman Empire continued on for another 400 years after Caesar. I mean, that's the Western Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire lasted into the Middle Ages under Byzantium. So again, nonsense, absolute nonsense. It doesn't mean anything. The fall of civilization narrative for Rome is pretty much, you can consider it as, has racial undertones. It's also got a lot of links to Western civilization and thought at the time. There are a lot of problems that can be addressed there, but that is a topic for another day. But essentially, the narrative doesn't make sense, because the Byzantine Empire under the Greeks, which was the Eastern Roman Empire, continued on well into the Middle Ages. So Rome didn't just collapse. The West, I mean, imploded, but then grew up around Christianity and reformed. Society is ebbing and flowing. It doesn't just collapse, and that's all nonsense, because a lot of pre-Christian thought and early Christian thought is indebted to Roman thought. So it's just nonsensical. It's unacademic. It's because these people want to make narratives. They don't really know what they're talking about. But then you have this journalist from the Daily Star who writes that Elon Musk was drawing a comparison to the final days of Julius Caesar's reign. Yet said reign saw the assassination of Emperor Caesar and subsequently the fall of the Roman Empire, which Musk fears may happen from modern society should the issues crop up again. Now, this is unacceptable. This is just it's just Unbelievable. So Caesar was not emperor; he was dictator for life. So him not being emperor, the empire, the Roman, what we call the Roman Empire, didn't start until Octavian became the first emperor. So, well, there's your first issue, and Octavian doesn't become emperor for another a decade at least after Caesar's death. So, there's the actual nuance of the historic issue. But the main problem with this is that this is, if you Google this, if you go onto Wikipedia and literally Google it in 2 seconds, was Caesar an emperor? No. When did the empire begin? When did the Roman Empire end? Google tells you the answer. It will give you a date. You just have to use some kind of critical thinking. This guy has read the tweet and gone, oh, here's an article. I'm just going to make stuff up and write an article about it. Like, it's not even fact checked. Um, and this is just it's just unbelievable that there's no editor that's read this and gone, you've just said that Caesar was an emperor. I'm gonna fact check you on that because I'm pretty sure that's wrong. No, it's just the critical thinking out the water, gone. People just stupid, and I'm sorry, but this is stupidity. It's stupidity because the author is either running with Musk's mistake, not checking on Musk and then writing an article about it, but trying to capitalize on Elon Musk's statement because you bring in more views if you tag Elon Musk in the headline, which is that's not journalism. You're not a journalist. You're a fanciful author if you're doing that, because your journalist's job is to read something and then think critically and then publish it and then see what's good and what's not good. Critical thinking is the most important part of journalism, in my opinion, and to be honest, the point of journalism in general. But modern journalism doesn't work like that, and that's why I would argue that most people that call themselves journalists aren't really journalists, because if you're trying to bait people in for clicks and you're trying to disingenuously mislead people, you're not a journalist. You've got an agenda there that's not journalism. It's just deliberately misleading people. Massive issue. No one's going to talk about this. Partly because the article was very hard to find. I found the article after like 3 times of trying to find the actual Elon Musk tweet, because it's at the bottom of a thread. But this is, this is how people trick. Because then I've seen the Musk tweet actually then put into like YouTube Shorts and people like praising Musk's astute comments, and you wonder why people like. Well, I mean, the end of civilization, the fall of civilization. If you think that civilization is going to fall, it's the fact that we have no critical thinking, and the people saying, "Oh, civilization is going to collapse," are just as guilty. Like, you're just really, really bad and really, really poorly read. And I think one thing that Elon Musk does is he reads like long scope history books, because he said in one of his tweets that he was reading a book about basically the ancient world by one author. It's a single authored book. It's essentially a summary. So you read a it's essentially like a non-expert book. It's just summarizing basic things. Okay, that's a good introduction to things. But then if you really want to talk about the nuances of things, then you have to do more research. But he doesn't. He stops there and thinks he knows everything. Obviously, if you're this is not your area of expertise, why are you going to pursue anything further? And that's fine, but then you don't pretend like you know about it. Like Elon Musk here has come out and said, oh yeah, I'm an expert on this situation because I read one book about it. I'm thinking, no, like, have you read it? And he may not have even, like I said, may not have even read that paper. It's abysmal. There's an error there from Elon, who, multiple times says, oh yeah, fact checkers, I'm against fact checkers. Well, that's because everyone is so politicized that no one can be bothered to even find out the truth. And this journalist here is, I mean, I believe obviously people can make mistakes, human error exists, but you don't, if you're writing about something that you're not knowledgeable on, the first thing that someone, if someone tells me something that I don't really know about, the first thing I want to do is go away and read about it, and then go, I've just discovered this, and this. This is on a first reading, maybe wrong. this is just what comes up if you Google it and have a little read. But if we're beyond the phase where people aren't even Googling things anymore because they're just, going to run with what someone, I don't know if people just presume that Elon Musk is a higher authority because he owns Twitter, therefore, like, he's just presumed as like, an expert on anything he tweets about. Like, the guy is an expert on some things, but certainly not ancient history. And I don't understand why then people, it's not even feel the need to comment. It's just make comments that are baseless. I hate baseless comments. Do some research. Do some reading. Pick up a book. It will really, really help. So topic number 1 turned into a rant. I thought that was going to be a small comment. Of course, not with me. Never is. Second thing is Dominic Raab, which I guess we can talk about alongside Diane Abbott, but I think that it needs addressing on its own. Because, Dominic Raab was forced to resign. He resigned after a report came to the Prime Minister, and then a day after the Prime Minister had the report, he resigned. He certainly dragged his heels in after being found to have thrown tomatoes at civil servants and just verbally abused them. And, he came out even after he resigned and said the findings of the inquiry were flawed. So it's really come out swinging there. So this report concluded that, at least 2 of the 8 complaints against him could be upheld, and probably by the information that they had. And Raab resigns and goes out swinging and says, the inquiry is flawed, sets out a dangerous precedent for the conduct of good government. I'm not going to go gracefully. I'm going to go out, swinging with absolutely frantically, and then blamed activist civil servants for his own sacking or resignation. Okay, well, that's a nice one, nice try. Then you had on LBC on Sunday, you had Amber Rudd call LBC and basically, mock Dominic Raab, not in a like a mocking way, but actually just by pointing out that what he's saying here is just nonsensical, because even if he's running the civil service how he's running it, it's wrong. And I will preface this against a Telegraph article that was written on the 21st of April. The Telegraph article says Dominic Raab's resignation is a victory for the work-shy civil service. The bureaucracy is undeniably failing Britain, and Dominic Raab was right not to go quietly, because civil servants and their largely left-wing champions were hoping that the report would lay bare the monstrous behaviour of the minister. And the document does question the civil service. It goes 2 ways, because the document is an independent report, and the document says that, clearly Dominic Raab was intimidating. He was being passive aggressive. He was being unreasonable. Clearly he is all these things. The civil service are equally, it sort of sums up that they equally paid their part, because there wasn't abuse. There was more abrasive attitude from Dominic Raab. That is fair, but in context, what is the wrong thing is the sort of logic that's used to get there. And this is why I brought up Amber Rudd's phone call into LBC, because what she said was, hold on a second, the way to run a good government department is to treat your civil servants with respect, include them, make them feel like part of a team, then the ship moves smoothly. And so the logic here is that if you've got the head of the team, the manager, basically being abrasive and passive aggressive, well, you're not going to want to play ball, and then things are only going to get worse. And that's pretty much what Amber Rudd said on her phone when she called into LBC, and this is what other people have stated. And I think there's some people have made some psychological tie-in where praise, a manager praising the team versus a manager pushing the team from the bottom, like saying, "Oh, come on, guys, do this, do this, do this, do this, do this." That apparently, this is anecdotal, so you know, I'm gonna say, this is not an expert opinion, but this is just from what I've read. Is that apparently there are more benefits to a team manager that praises than a team manager that pushes, and that's because that you increase motivation by praising, and so therefore you're more likely to have a more efficient team in the first example than the second. It makes sense, and that I think would definitely work for me if I had someone, telling me what to do, or if then I had someone, commenting on my good work, in equal situations. I'm the sort of person that would react more to the praise. Again, some people like working under stress. Some people maybe like getting pushed. Um, so it's a lot of the personal element into it, but I think that it's a complete false equivalency to say, oh well, the civil service work shy because they didn't like getting complained at, and so therefore they worked less. So it's like, well, yeah, to me, that's if I was in their shoes, that would be bleeding obvious and my absolute direction I would take. It doesn't mean that that is the case, but just offering my opinion, my side of things is that I agree. That's what I would do. If I went into work this week, my manager turned around and started shouting at me to do things, or like being really passive aggressive at me to do things, I would certainly do them slower than what I normally would do, because I'd be like, well, what's this is your issue, not mine. You're making the environment really negative, and I would react in a negative way. Again, it's just worth commenting on, and people are relating the response of Rishi Sunak to what happened with Diane Abbott. I don't think they're comparable because one required a report and the other one was so blatantly in the open, and we'll get to that in a second. But what Diane Abbott said was so blatantly in the open that the investigation comes second. I think that's fair, because this is not a case of he said, she said. This is just an objective thing that was said. And so, segueing on to Diane Abbott. Diane Abbott has had the party. She's been kicked out of the Labour Party. I think she's had the whip withdrawn, pending investigations. So she could be invited back into the party for what have essentially been titled as racist or anti-Semitic comments that she made in a tiny little segment to what I believe was The Observer. It's like she wrote a letter. She wrote in responding to an article from Tamiwa Owolade that claimed racism in Britain is not a black and white issue. It's far more complicated, and that article was responding to the recent survey that came out on experienced racism, where I think the traveller community, I think it's like 60% experienced racism in the traveller community, then it was like 55 in the Jewish community, and then 50 in the Black Caribbean community, and I think they were the highest three. So what the survey, and this is stats off the top of my head, I may be correct, or I think I'm rounding in my head, but I think what it found was that there is a lot of racism towards a couple of communities, predominantly traveller, Jewish, and then this Black Caribbean community. The Black African community, I think, suffered from less racism, which was an interesting thing. I think that statistic went down to the 30s. 30% of people from that community suffered racism. That's an interesting thing in itself. But then the article is obviously pressing on these issues and saying, well, hey, look, here are all the people that saying they've suffered from racism. Wow, look at that. It's a spread, and it's different, and it's not, black and white to to reuse the phrase. It's really really intermixed. And so Diane Abbott throws a hat in the ring, and she says, "Oh yeah, well, Timiwa Walade claims that Irish, Jewish, and traveller people all suffer from racism," and she's put racism in quotations. Well, that's great. That's you're going on a bad step when you do that. She says they undoubtedly experience prejudice. This is similar to racism. Prejudice is apparently similar to racism. Well, surely racism is a form of prejudice, so I don't. Again, just dangerous there, and the two words are often used as if they are interchangeable. Don't want to get the dictionary out too early, but I'm pretty sure racism is a form of prejudice. And she goes on to say, it is true that many types of white people with points of difference, such as redheads, can experience this prejudice. And this is the big quote that she compared Jews to redheads. Oh dear. Not looking good, is it? Let's, get through the next couple of lines. But they are not all their lives subject to racism. In pre-civil rights America, Irish people, Jewish people, and travellers were not required to sit at the back of the bus. In apartheid South Africa, these groups were allowed to vote, and at the height of slavery, there were no white-seeming people manacled on the slave ships. Diane Abbott from the House of Commons, London, SW1. Well, that is, just undefendable. And she instantly, like the day after, yesterday, she retracted her statement. She said, "Oh yeah, I'm wrong. Jews did experience racism." And this obviously has led to the logical conclusion that why have you written this in the first place? I think she said, "Oh, it was just a draft." Why, if you're drafting this, again, it's like, have you not read? I mean, I'm pretty sure she's a lawyer, or she's something to do with law. And I think if you look at the dictionary definition or the legal definition of race, and from the UK, which I don't like, because it's a horrible definition. It's really, really, race is being worked out. But, that's besides the point. It's like the legal definition of race is being part of a group of people who are identified by their race, colour, nationality, citizenship, ethnic or national origins. So in the UK, you're a victim of racism if you're prejudiced for being from a certain country. So, for example, if I don't know, let's pick. If I'm from Nepal, I don't know why that country came to head. If I'm from Nepal, and someone made a sign in their shop saying, "Oh, no Nepalese people in my shop," that's racism according to the legal definition. And if you said, "Well, this person is being racist," according to the definition, you'd be correct. That's the issue of racism. The issue of racism is exactly, and the term racism is exactly the issue with this statement. So then, we have a look at responses. We can have a look at some really useful responses, because this is the place to start. We have essentially the Board of Deputies of British Jews, who said her apology is unconvincing, her letter to the Observer was disgraceful, and yet she needs the whip to be removed. You have the sect of there are a group of Jews within the Labour Party that said the Jewish Voice for Labour group, which said that a letter should have been drafted. Miss Abbott's letter should have been drafted with more care, but there was no grounds for suspension of the party. So you don't have a uniform response. And then you have her actual statement was, "I'm writing my letter that was writing regarding my letter I can't read that was recently published in the Observer. She wholly and undeservedly withdraws her remarks and dissociates herself from them." That's not how it works. Okay, you can learn with time, but not after a couple of days of being told you're wrong. Racism takes many forms, and it's completely undeniable that Jewish people have suffered its monstrous effects, as have Irish people, travellers, and many others. Once again, she apologises. Um, you know that that's not if it was something that came out 30 years ago, that she'd wrote 30 years ago, and then said, "Oh yeah, by the way, I've evolved since then," that makes sense. When you write something, say it's I think she said it's the errors arose in an initial draft being sent. So if you're drafting that, you clearly believe those ideas, and people saying, "Oh, you can't defend this position now. You can't defend her position because she's already disassociated herself from them." No, because that's just that's rhetoric in itself. So then we had the response, and the response basically comes in the same form. Obviously, it's racist for what she said. I think everyone has said that. But then you have Jake Wallace Simons, who was interviewed by Sky from the Jewish Chronicle, that said she was attempting to redefine racism as only the experience of black people, or probably more specifically, redefine racism based on skin color. Again, that's his statement there is slightly incorrect, and we'll get into that again. And then we have the initial author of the article that Diane Abbott was responding to, Tamiwa Owolade, who wrote an article, essentially a retort. For one who knows the pain of racism, Diane Abbott shows such ignorance, and brings up the same issues. Writing a letter in response takes time and effort. It's not thoughtless. This is come with thought, and he's basically criticizing the narrow conception of what constitutes race. This is a quote. So Abbott has a narrow conception of what constitutes racism. It's certainly narrow, but I don't think it comes from ignorance. And this is where we have to get into some uncomfortable, I would say, truths, certainly uncomfortable notions. What I would describe this as is not ignorance, but it is essentially primitivism in terms of it's primitivism on the term of racism. So it's fundamentalism, maybe a better word. So essentially, a fundamentalist approach to race and racism works simply with the sort of old school categories of race, and that's what this is doing. It's saying that, well, racism is focused on race, and so therefore it is discrimination if you're black, if you're brown, if you're white, and then however you want to problematically, because then this is even inherently problematically, color other people. If you're going to start saying, oh well, yeah, you're being othered because of your skin color, it is fundamentalist racism because it's working on the definition of race. Now, that in itself is, I hate the word racism, and I hate it because we've moved really past, and this is why I hate the definition of racism, is that we've moved past that. Racism has sort of been subsided, definitely in the sort of academic terminology, with ethnicity. The reason, and even when we fill out surveys, like if you do a government, or like if you do the YouGov poll, or the government, what's the word? I'm completely blanking. The government does the census. Thank you very much, Brain, for telling me about 5 seconds late. Yeah, if you do a census, you'll ask for your ethnicity. You're not asked for your race, because we've phased out the word racism. It was, and this is something that links very much to the Jewish people. People will quote Hitler and the Nazi propaganda for saying that. Or people say, oh yeah, well the Jews were considered an inferior race, but Hitler's racial ideology comes a lot from like pseudo Greek. I know why pseudo Greek, because he conceptualizes race as sort of like ethnicity. If you think about Greek, the Greek ethnos, which is where we get the word ethnicity from, can take many forms, and it can take literally the form of your city-state, your tribe, as it were. So you're sort of, different. These are different sub-ethnic identities, and then the Greeks or the Hellenes, Greeks coming from Latin, Hellenes coming from Greek. So the Hellenes are an ethnos, and inside of them there are different ethni, the plural, and there are different ethni, and these take different forms. And so that's how Hitler, the Aryan race is an ethnos. It's a group of people that, with racial theory at the time, it's a group of people that are white, but then they're also more superior than other white people because they're Aryan. And the Aryans, I mean, there was a lot of problematic scholarship that tried to link Aryanism with the Greeks, so on and so forth. Now, and I think this is the sort of thing that people, it's not really taught, and people don't really know about. And yes, this seems massively tangential, but it's completely relevant. Is that the Aryans were not the only sub-ethnic group race that were the whites and then perceiving their own race. There was also, I believe he was a Sicilian anthropologist called Giuseppe Sergi, and Sergi wrote a book called The Mediterranean Race, in which he argues for a superior inter-European race of Mediterraneans that essentially that are different, and based on migratory patterns are different from other Europeans. And he links a bunch of areas that were of the Mediterranean race. And this is in counterclash to, I think, the rise in Aryanism, and this is way before World War II. I think Sergi's book came out in the early 1900s. So this is the discourse of early 1900s race. Yes, I've summarized it down to two schools of thought. I'm sure there are more. I'm not a complete expert, but I know of those two. So you have essentially inter-white race, horribly problematic. I think the Mediterranean race, a lot of it was based on craniology, which is now a pseudoscience, which was like really serious back in the day. Like the size of your head mattered as to what race you belonged to, and where you descended from. It's horribly, like, just unapologetically just wrong. But yeah, that was a big thing at the time, and so this is like fundamentalism. Like there are fundamental scientific, and these are in air quotes, scientific ways of showing race, and this is old school thought. And so then what happens is that after the horrors of World War II, a lot of the discourse focuses on, well, clearly our concept of race is incredibly problematic, and it's incredibly problematic because if we're talking about race and then racial superiority, which is obviously what a lot of Aryanism is about, the Aryans being the best, Mediterranean race, they're the best. A lot of this racial superiority, first off, it doesn't mark, it has no sort of distinguished marker with what we'd now term as ethnic groups or sub-ethnic groups. So the Jews, if you want to call them a race, you can. It's problematic, and it's problematic because it has connotations that are problematic. So you say the Jews from the Greek are an ethnos. They're a people, they're a collective group of people. Hence, where we get the term ethnicity. They are an ethnic group, and that has a lot more cultural connotations rather than it does biological, because a lot of the discourse on race was biological, and so we've moved past that since World War II, because the focus has moved away from the biology and the science, and it's moved towards a more cultural experience. Obviously, there is still science, pseudoscience, what have you, observation behind ethnic identity. A lot of the base form of, like, you can be ethnically white, ethnically black, so on and so forth. But the current theory, and a lot of the theory that I subscribe to and I try to formulate, has these overlapping identities. It has, multiple forms, as we saw with the Greeks. Ethnos does not just mean one thing, and therefore, it is a dialogue. It is something that's shaped by discourse. It is something that is both emikinetic, it is othering, and it's inclusive in different forms, and it is completely and utterly complex. It can, and the reason why, the discourse is moving to that point is because you have to start acknowledging the complexity of these issues, because if you simplify it down, I mean, even to the census, what ethnicity are you? Oh, are you white? It's like white British, white Irish, I think white traveller may actually be on the census. Black Caribbean, black African, white other, I think it's another thing. Well, white other is not an ethnicity. It's not a group that, oh, well, I mean, I group myself as white other. It's like, no, that's like an ethnic designation, because the purpose of the survey is census, sorry, is to just know whether you're of British descent or not. So therefore it's inherently ethnic, and so you can't say that that's an ethnicity. It seems very tangential, but it gets to the point, because you have this really really complex um, approach to ethnicity. It does not really manifest itself in political discourse very well. And the reason why is because a lot of the political discourse is not really backed by, I mean, my scholarship is, the scholarship that I use is loosely ethnicity, but then more focused on the ancient world. So, I have a loose understanding. I tend to stay away from a lot of some of the modern sociology, because obviously that has purposes that I don't need, because it's talking about modern approaches. So I use the sort of the sociological background and then how it's been transformed in the ancient world. But it just doesn't get brought into the discussion because it is so complex. It's I've heard a couple of people say it's contrived. It is difficult. It's difficult to work through. That is absolutely true. But the difficulties help us because they stop what Diane Abbott has done. Because Diane Abbott has gone, oh well, we've gone back to the fundamental observational definition of racism. It's not ignorance. It's not a redefinition. As we've seen these people say. That's the problem. This is not new. This is old. It's so old. It's ignorance is not even a way to perceive this, because it is in itself a very twisted perception. But yeah, it's a fundamental approach to racism that just goes, well, you have X skin color, you can be racist. You have Y skin color, you can't be racist. And Diane Abbott is not unique in this. We see this a lot with the American left and discourses on the American left. And we've even seen this with academic attempts to redefine racism as through positions of power. So then they would say, well, white people are in power, which is Diane Abbott's argument here. Diane Abbott's argument is quite. This is where you can say it's a redefinition, but it's a redefinition based on fundamentalism. This is why we need to understand this. That they would say, well, it's based, racism comes from positions of power. So this is why Diane Abbott's argument is, well, in these positions where we were subjected to, abject dehumanization, you guys could do the things that we couldn't. Therefore, you guys couldn't have been victims of racism. Now, this is where my really, really, really confusing approach works, and it helps because you can say, well, yeah, there was this discourse between black people and white people, but then there's also an inter-white discourse between sub-ethnic identities. The Irish people, Ireland was physically colonized by England. Like Cromwell. There was a lot of Cromwell did some serious purging towards the Irish. That is racism. But it is not racism. It's racism how it would be defined. It's ethnocentrism. The English are an ethnos. They're a group of people, and they are subjecting the Irish. That is inter sub-ethnic prosecution, whatever you want to call it. And this is why, we have to use these really complex definitions because, God, it's really complex in history. Because at the same time, both the Irish and the English can perceive themselves as superior to black people and superior to Indians, but then, the English can perceive themselves as superior to the Irish. And that works on both, and that works, they're not contradictory because they're working on different levels of, perception. That doesn't mean that Irish people aren't subject to racism. I mean, you think about anti-Semitism in Europe has been rife for the past 1,000 years. There've been. I chose Irish just because it was a good example of essentially inter-European colonization. Ireland was essentially colonized by England. But then, if we talk about anti-Semitism, which is the harder hitting one, is that they were literally forced to. They were kicked out of Western Europe, pretty much. I think. They were kicked out of England, France, Spain. I think Germany. Most of Western Europe, Jews were barred from going to the country in the Middle Ages, and this is why there was a high Jewish population in Eastern Europe, and then this is why Zionism arises out of the fact that mass anti-Semitism and the desire for the rise in nationalism. Of course, is the Jewish people don't have a home; they've not been integrated into society because they've been kicked out. They have been othered completely because of their religion. That's the Jews as an ethnic identity have been victims of persecution for a good couple of the Romans were anti-Semitic. Obviously, not all Romans. The Romans in Rome were quite anti-Semitic. There were a lot of Roman authors who were anti-Semitic. That does not mean that everyone was anti-Semitic in the Roman Empire, but there was a lot of specifically anti-Jewish sentiment, a lot of anti-Christian sentiment, because Christianity and Judaism were initially quite interlinked. So, we have to recognize that these things can happen concurrently. And not only can they happen concurrently, but they do not rule out another. So the fact that the Jews experienced anti-Semitism doesn't rule out that some of them may have participated and benefited from the slave trade, because they work on different levels, and whether people perceive these levels of identity or not, they clearly exist, because otherwise everyone would, otherwise there'd be these really, really easy bordered identities. They don't exist, and we know they don't exist because how many people in society conceive of these identities? Not many of them, because it's not an actual thought that many people have. However, they all have these identities and they're navigating them. It's just that the perceptions of identity are very complex, and so it's not something that people think about. But this is something that must, I think, but even the discourse has fallen down because it doesn't bring in the relevant or the needed arguments. Because, for example, in Tommy was hit back at Diane Abbott. Basically, he says that she's wrong in even what she's saying. Yeah, she's wrong on her own terms because Jewish and Irish people have most certainly been discriminated against in America, for example. Yeah, I mean, no Catholics. No Irish was something that happened during the sort of, I don't know, British apartheid. In the sort of post-war period where you have in bed sits is it no blacks and no Irish? Is that I've seen a couple of those signs online, people sharing them as to show Irish discrimination. But the thing is that saying that, oh yeah, you're wrong because Jewish and Irish people have been discriminated against. She's not saying they haven't been discriminated against. It's the perception of racism, which is very specific, because she doesn't see racism as factoring in sub-ethnic identities. So you can't say, oh well, you're wrong or you're redefining something. It's that argument is flawed, because you're never going to win by saying, oh, you're wrong, I'm right. because it's a perception. The most important thing we're dealing with is discourse. So we have to recognize. First off, you have to recognize what's going on. You have to recognize that this is a fundamentalist approach to race and racism. You have to recognize that it's built on essentially, biological characteristics. I mean, in this case, it's literally based on your skin color. Horrible, horrible way to approach any form of identity singularly, because if you believe that your skin color denotes your most important identity, I think that I feel so, there's clearly something wrong there. But you have to start acknowledging that, because if you don't acknowledge that, you won't get to the root of the issue. If you can't, and this is why this is such a big issue. And people haven't been, people have not been doing discourse right. People haven't been acknowledging the actual issue, and that's because I think that we've lent slightly into the away from the subjectivity, and away from the actual understanding the history of some of these concepts, because they're so embedded in our words. Racism, it's such an embedded term. How many people could actually define racism? I don't think that many would be able to. I don't like the definition of racism, because I feel like it is inherently problematic. It doesn't factor. You can't. What's happened is just that we've had racism, and then we've just put in a bunch of other, definitions. It's like, oh yeah, you can be racist. Like, racism obviously has connotations with race, but now it just means so much more than race. Well, maybe we should have picked a better term. Maybe ethnicism doesn't really make sense. Yeah, we're stuck with a term with particular connotations to race, but it doesn't mean that. So when you say a term like, "Oh, you're a victim of prejudice," Diane Abbott is not saying that those people haven't been persecuted. She's just saying that that's not racism because of her definition, and it essentially elevates the importance of race and racial discrimination over the sub-ethnic discriminations, and that's fundamentalist, and that's what she's saying. And I've not seen a single person correctly highlight that at the moment. I've seen it's a redefinition. I've seen a lot of the rhetoric of redefinition. I've seen a lot of the rhetoric of ignorance, but I've not seen anyone actually attempting. People have agreed with her and said, yeah, they're right, but I've not seen any summary of what that actually means. Because okay, there's a lot of well, she's offering us essentially some complex theoretical approach where she's saying prejudice, like interracial prejudice is not racism. Okay, what does that actually mean? Well, it means that people are discriminated against. It's just that race is first and foremost biological. I don't actually think I've seen anyone say that. It is inherently problematic, and it has these inherent connotations that need to be brought out. Absolutely serious. The discourse is like, I mean, all three things that we've talked about today have discourse issues. I think the Dominic Wilde one, the least. I think that's most of that was my opinion on that. The first issue with what Elon Musk is saying, and people criticizing SpaceX, and they're not criticizing Elon Musk's sociological comments, and then now this with the race issues, they are primarily discourse issues, because people are not saying the right thing. And the reason why people are not saying the right thing is because I think people are struggling to even conceive of these multi-layered overlapping things. And that's because well, for me it's so easy to conceive, because I've been reading about it for years and years, but because we're not really being presented with schema for these things, we're not, you can put them in basic, because maybe we should start putting them in really basic terms and then ramping them up. Start off when we're younger. First off, we can get rid of the word race. I think that's probably what we need to do, because the word race has so many problematic connotations. It's just so problematic. race doesn't mean anything. There are not, there's no races. It's a lot of that is Western thought, grouping people into neatly bordered categories that don't exist. Some of them are based on migratory patterns, but even then, it doesn't work because people then, since the early migration, have moved since. So then, what race are There's too many questions that arise from race, and then we still have racism from race. We just have so many. I mean, people would argue that they're pedantic, but I would argue that the lack of pedantic argumentation leads to this situation. And I'm not saying that. I think the most important thing is that I'm not picking on Diane Abbott as an individual. Diane Abbott is representative of a sizable portion of the Labour Party with these beliefs, and a sizable portion of left wing discourse with these beliefs. Happens in America as well. It's just that Diane Abbott, as a prominent figure, has aired this. And this is why attacking Diane Abbott and saying you're wrong, this is why it's an understanding. Because some people, I think, are sort of thinking that Diane Abbott has come up with these views almost on her own. They're saying, they're talking about her as an individual. Oh, she's just ignorant. But no, these views are formulated with conversations of people that agree. Probably Jeremy Corbyn as well. I can imagine Jeremy Corbyn, and that sort of those sort of people will perceive things in similar ways. They will have the same concepts of race, discrimination, concepts on anti-Semitism itself, and they will see that one prioritizes the other. And this is the thing with levels of identity. Levels of identity does not mean the top level is the most important. It just means it's the broadest. You have the broadest, the most expanding. Okay, if you want to argue on that way, the top level is we're all human. That's the real top level of identity is humanity. We're all human, and then we can break ourselves down into different levels. You can have continental, racial. They actually work on the same level, because continental and racial are just arbitrary divisions of major groups of people, really. And this is what we mean, and we just break down to the smallest. We go from the biggest to the smallest. That's all we mean when we talk about levels of identity. And that conception, because it's it's not understood, it's not schematized. Maybe I need to start reading some more modern sociology, but I've not seen, I'm not seeing people talk about this, and I'm trying my hardest too, and I'm trying to talk about it with a lot of people. It's very complex, very complicated. But I will push this. I will push this way because I believe that it is so fundamental for some of these culture war issues. Because this is a culture war issue in itself. It's the protection of black racism versus other communities. Oh well, you can't be victims of racism, therefore look black racism back on top. Black Caribbeans, oh, they're actually victims of racism. Oh, anti-Semitism and anti-traveller sentiment, which are being felt more according to the survey. No, push them back down. That's what it is. It's putting us back on. It's putting us from Diane Abbott's perspective and their perspective back on top. It's rewriting the discourse, because if you change the definitions, you exclude them from the issue in the first place. It's as simple as that. This is why this is one of the reasons why I'm doing this podcast, because every week I will always try I will always try and offer this type of discourse. I will always incentivize, and also I will always incentivize people to talk to me, come and talk to me about these issues. If you want to have a conversation about them, tell me your perspective, tell me how you perceive things, and also tell me where you think I'm wrong or where you think I can improve. And also I will always incentivize people to write comments, because the only way you're going to get past any of these issues is by mass societal discourse, and it doesn't happen because everyone lives in echo chambers. Too many echo chambers to count. And again, echo chambers can be perceived as these levels. People prioritize identities over others inherently, or they either doing it deliberately, non-deliberately. Like I said, sometimes it's inherent. Sometimes it's just by nature of how you've grown up and where you've grown up, and all of these things matter and make the difference. But that's what we need to start talking about. So as always, thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for getting to this point. This is very important for me, and I really hope you enjoyed this. And as always, I will see you in the next one.